All right, today we're diving into one of the most epic stories ever told, the Exodus. But we're going to peel back the layers of the Hollywood version, because the original text reveals a story that's way more fascinating and, in some ways, a lot more logical. So, let's get into it.
Just try to imagine this for a second. You have just escaped generations of slavery. You're running for your life, and you slam into a dead end. Behind you, you can hear the chariots of the most powerful army in the world getting closer and closer. And in front of you, a giant body of water. There is literally nowhere to run.
I mean, this wasn't just a physical trap. It was a total crisis of faith. What happened next? Well, it would become the single most important moment in their entire history. This was the story they would tell their kids and their kids' kids for thousands of years.
Okay, so let's really break down this moment of just absolute panic. Pharaoh had let them go after that 10th plague, right? But almost immediately, he starts having second thoughts. The text literally says he's thinking, wait, what did we just do? We just lost our entire workforce. So naturally, he gathers his best chariots and races after them.
And what's the very first thing the Israelites do when they see that army on the horizon? They freak out. They turn on Moses with this incredibly bitter, sarcastic complaint. Can you believe it? After witnessing 10 plagues and a supernatural escape, their first instinct is just complete despair. And honestly, this kind of becomes a pattern for them.
But here is the major plot twist. The text makes it super clear that this whole situation was not an accident. God intentionally led them to this exact spot. Now, why would he do that? Well, it was all about setting the stage. The book of Exodus basically says God did this so that he could gain glory through Pharaoh and his army. This was a setup for a final, jaw-dropping demonstration of power.
And that demonstration, of course, is the famous parting of the sea. But the details of which sea we're talking about, well, they're kind of a big deal. As you're about to see, one little translation detail pretty much changes everything we think we know about this miracle.
This is the image we all have, right? You think of the movie, these huge, towering walls of deep ocean water. It's an amazing cinematic moment, for sure. But the original Hebrew text points to a different, and you could argue, a more plausible location.
And here's the key. The name Red Sea is actually a much later Greek translation. The original Hebrew text uses the phrase Yam Suf. And what does Yam Suf mean? It literally translates to Sea of Reeds. And that little detail, it has massive implications.
This just completely changes the picture. So instead of the deep, vast Red Sea, a lot of scholars think Yam Suf is talking about the Bitter Lakes region, which is this series of shallow, marshy, reedy lakes. And that location, it also happens to line up perfectly with the probable escape route they took.
And just think about it for a second. The text in Exodus is super specific. It says, all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind. Now, a wind might not part a deep ocean, but a powerful, sustained wind blowing all night, it could absolutely push back the shallow waters of a marshy lake and create a path of dry ground. The miracle is still a miracle. It's just that the text itself might be giving us the mechanics of how it happened.
And the result for the Egyptians was just as devastating. The Israelites make it across safely, but those heavy Egyptian chariots, they get completely stuck in the mud on the lake bed. So when the wind stops and the water rushes back, the army is totally wiped out. The main point was achieved. Egypt would finally and without a doubt know who Yahweh is.
You would think that after a miracle like that, their problems would be over. But nope. Now they begin a 40-year journey through the wilderness. And that brings a whole new set of challenges and a whole new set of lessons.
And here we go again. I mean, it's only a few chapters after being saved from the most powerful army on earth, and the people are already complaining. This time, they're hungry, and they're actually looking back fondly on their time as slaves, because hey, at least they had full stomachs.
So, God provides. This strange, flaky stuff starts appearing on the ground every morning. And the name we all know it by, manna, actually comes from the Israelites' completely confused reaction. When they first saw it, they literally turned to each other and asked in Hebrew, manhu, which just means, what is it? And, well, the name just stuck.
But this wasn't some magical all-you-can-eat buffet. This food came with very specific rules, and these rules were basically a daily test. You could only gather enough for that one day, which forced you to trust that there'd be more tomorrow. And by gathering a double portion on the 6th day, you were learning to set aside a day of rest, the Sabbath. So really, the manna wasn't just about food. It was a 40-year-long training exercise in trust. It was designed to break their old slave mindset of hoarding and insecurity and instead teach them to depend on God one day at a time. As the book of Deuteronomy puts it later, the whole point was to teach them that man does not live on bread alone.
Okay, now let's zoom out, because the sequence of these events, getting rescued first and then getting the rules second, is maybe the single most important theological point in this whole story. Just look at this. The entire 215-year period of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob gets about 68 pages in the Bible. But this relatively short, 40-year trip through the wilderness, it gets over 350 pages. That's more than 5 times the attention. So why? Why is this short period so incredibly important?
Because it is hammering home this one core truth. Deliverance does not come from following the rules. Think about it. The Israelites weren't rescued because they were super good people or because they followed a set of laws perfectly. They were rescued while they were still slaves, while they were complaining, while they were constantly messing up.
The law, the 10 Commandments and everything else they get in Mount Sinai, all of that comes after they've already been saved. It's not a ladder you climb to earn your salvation. It's more like an instruction manual for a people who have already been set free. It's a response to grace, not a way to earn it.
And the text is just brutally honest about this. Moses reminds them straight up that God didn't choose them because they were so righteous. In fact, he calls them a stiff-necked people, which is not a compliment. Their rescue is purely an act of God's love and his promise to their ancestors. Period. And this one event, this incredible act of grace, became the defining story for the rest of Israel's national and spiritual history. I mean, it's everywhere. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, whenever Israel needs a reminder of who God is and who they are, they look back to this moment. In their laws, in their songs, in their warnings from the prophets, it all comes back to, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. It became the absolute bedrock of their faith.
So in the end, this real historical event became this incredibly powerful metaphor, a journey from slavery through a wilderness of testing and into a promised land of rest. It's a story that is echoed through the centuries. And it kind of leaves us with a question, doesn't it? If God can redeem a stiff-necked people from a physical trap, what does that journey from bondage to freedom look like for us today? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for digging into this with me.